Welcome back to Empirical Evidence. 5 examples of energy disruption cycles that are spiritual violence are antagonism against the principles and powers, which are the higher forces. Do you serve the higher forces, or are you a spirit of antagonism against the principles and powers you promise to serve? Now remember, not every antagonistic person or a person who seems antagonistic or bantering is a spiritually violent person. I'll give you an example. I had a great friend, and I say had because he died a couple years ago, and it was one of the hardest periods of my life. His name was Brother Ilred. Brother Ilred was a very, very cheerful friend who had a hard life. Now, he was a combination of an Irishman. We're talking about personality. Whoopi Goldberg and John Leguizamo. So Brother L was very funny. He's probably the only person who could poke fun at me and I would still laugh about everything. And his jokes were very scratching at the very core of truth of whatever you were hiding in your soul. So, for example, if he knew that here's a safe example. If he knows that I'm struggling economically, Brother Elred would turn around and say to me, "You're already poor. You're never going to get rich. You're never going to have any money. You make a great nun. So stop fighting and give it all up. Give it all up. Embrace your poverty." And I would laugh because he knew that I was running away from poverty. He knew that poverty was not something that is spiritually healthy. And he knows that it bothered me, but when he said it, I could laugh. So it's not spiritual violence. And why is it not spiritual violence? Because his principles and powers were aligned. He lived poverty. He lived goodness. He shared everything he had with strangers and friends and neighbors. He always spoke the truth about people and about his life, even if it didn't gain him friends. His spiritual principle, as he said, he's a monk, but he was a Christian monk. He said, "I'm for Christ." And he understood what the principles of Christ were. He understood what the power was. The power was to choose nonviolence, and the principle was to live by truth. And so anyone who called himself a friend to him should be able to live by truth. Also, the name Elred is the name of ancient Cistercian monk who is also rooted in the principle of what Christian friendship should look like. So he exemplified that, my friend. And that is my example of that all antagonism is not spiritual violence. When the antagonism is rooted in pushing someone off a bridge, it's motivated by purely self-gain, that is spiritual violence. When the antagonism is rooted in the need to control people, that is spiritual violence. Spiritual violence is a force acting against a force in order to have dominion over that force. That is violence. The second example of spiritual violence, of 5 examples of energy disruption cycles that are spiritual violence, is people against our spiritual values. Our core values are what it's called in America, but it's really spiritual values. Core values can be positive or negative, but since we live in an America that has rejected spirituality and religion, core values is the term preferred to be used by this society. People against our core values, they penetrate our energy fields often, and this creates a sense of spiritual violence. We feel it like like little pebbles in our shoes. It's also what's meant by "on equal yoke cannot be joined." 2 people of opposing core values of the soul cannot be one house. They cannot be married. They cannot be one community. It will not work. The forces work through our hearts, but they need our mind to do that. And that is why people of similar minds do get along. They do gravitate toward each other. And people of differing minds find themselves in a form of antagonism. Now, just because the words are different doesn't mean the minds differ. I think Tutu Desmond, and some of the great mystical writers of the world have shown us that being of similar mind is not a religious thing. It's really about sharing core principles. But language is the way we move towards finding those core principles. And language is something that the mind expresses with words. And it reflects the heart's intent. So really, when the hearts are not in alignment, that's when you find spiritual violence starts to occur. Another example of energy disruption that's spiritual violence is social abuse of the body or non-use of the body. Social abuse being one extreme and non-use being the other extreme. This creates limited interconnectivity. One more, dishonesty or hatred from the people we gave trust to. Because we shared our forces with them, and forces are always in competition in the world, in the unconscious and social level. Spiritual violence erupts when we give our trust to someone and find that they're in competition, meaning they need to one-up us or be better than us. Because love means interdependency. It means being there for each other. Someone who's in competition with you we're not talking about healthy competition. Someone who's in competition with you is not about looking out for you. They're not trying to be there for you. Competition is force against force. That is not living in harmony, and therefore that is a path towards spiritual violence. Another example of energy cycle disruption that spiritual violence is leadership allegiance towards a person who breaks the principles of their role. Again, each person in the world has a role. The role that they carry is demonstrated by their title. When you give your trust and they break the duties and responsibilities of that role, your soul registers that as spiritual violence. That's probably the first level that you registered at. It's one of the reasons that the 10 Commandments were so important, or the Decalogue. Now, I'm not preaching religion. I'm trying to tell you that a long time ago, the human soul was understood by humanity. We understood that we lived by codes of conduct and principles. And those codes of conduct and principles were ingrained in our life path, in the roles that we took on. And when we moved away from those roles, responsibilities, our neighbor who trusted us recognized a violation of the code of trust. That itself is harm, and harm is spiritual violence.